Hi, Algebra 1 students. Okay, so this is like the second to last thing that we want to do so that we can earn all the standards for the Making a Move lab. Um, so the first thing we want to do is just review a little bit. We want to review factoring to solve equations, okay? So remember, this is where you guys kind of did that maze, and you had to think of two numbers that when multiplied gave you 12, but when added gave you a negative 7, okay? So that's where you kind of have to just think. You can list the factors of 12 if you want. So 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Those are the factors of 12. And then you'd have to think which one, if added or subtracted, could give you a 7. And you can kind of see here that the 3 and the 4 together, they do make 7. And then you just got to figure out the signs. In order to get a positive 12, they both either have to be positive or they both have to be negative. And in our case, they both have to be negative because we have a negative 7 in the middle. So when we write our factors out, we have to say x minus 3 and x minus 4, okay? And then just remember, once you factor it, in order to solve, you set each of these factors that you just found equal to 0, and then you'll be able to find the two zeros. So I'll do that over here. So x minus 3 equals 0. And then if you were to add 3 to both sides, you would get x equals 3. Okay, so that's 1, 0. That's the place where it crosses the x-axis. And then over here, x minus 4 equals 0. And just like the other equation, just because you see a minus 4 there, you're going to add 4 to both sides. So x equals 4. So that's how you solve by factoring. You factor it and then set each of those factors equal to 0. Okay, that's like a little bit of a review. The other one that I wanted to go over that I know you guys just wanted to review was the quadratic formula. We're going to use this when we do an application next. So remember, the quadratic formula, it's a way to find the zeros, just kind of like factoring. It's just you're using a formula. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so again, it has a's, b's, and c's. And remember, those a's, b's, and c's you can actually find by looking at your equation if it's in the right form. If everything is set equal to 0, everything's on one side, then you can find a, b, and c, and you just plug them into this formula and find the answer. So I can tell already by looking at this that a equals 2. So I'm just going to write that down here. A equals 2, because that's the leading term here. Okay, that's where a would be. B is the second term, the x term. So b, it looks like, is a positive 11. So b equals 11. And c is this number right here, okay, this last number, the constant, and it's a negative 21. Just look at the sign in front. So c equals negative 21. And so from there, you just basically plug in the a's, b's, and c's in here, and you figure out what your answers are. So let's start to do that. So x equals. So this says take the opposite of b. Opposite sign, basically. So if you have a positive 11, we're going to make it a negative 11. So we're going to say negative 11 plus or minus, and now we have to square b. B is 11, so 11 squared. Put it in parentheses, especially if it's a negative. Minus, just following the formula, 4 times a times c. So 4 times a is 2. C is negative 21. Remember, this is all under the square root. And then that's all over 2 times a. A is 2. So basically we just have to simplify this and figure out what our two solutions are. There are two solutions because you have a plus and a minus. That means one of the solutions that we find will be using the plus sign to find it, and one will be using the minus sign to find it. So let's figure out what this stuff is under here, okay? So if you were to just put this in your calculator, you would want to do 11 squared, okay? And then you'll do minus 4, and I'll put parentheses in here. I can actually put them around the 11, but since it's not negative, we don't have to worry about that. If it is a negative, put parentheses around that before you square it. But yeah, so it's 4 times 2 times negative 21. Okay? So that's 289. So that whole thing underneath the square root then is 289. So this is negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 289 over, and then 2 times 2 is 4. So I can write that in there. All right, and then we want to just simplify the 289 square rooted. So square root of 289, 17. So now I can write negative 11 plus or minus 17 over 4. And what that tells me is I'm going to have now two answers. One of my answers is going to be, just like I had two answers on the previous problem, negative 11 plus 17 over 4. And my other value is going to be negative 11 minus 17 over 4. And again, that's the way that the quadratic equation works. It has a plus or minus. And again, that means you're going to have two different solutions. So, okay, and you'll have two different solutions if this value is something other than 0, really. So negative 11 plus 17 is 6. And 6 over 4, we just want to reduce that basically, but that's really our answer. But 6 over 4, if we divide 6 by 2, we get a 3. And if we divide 4 by 2, we get a 2. So 3/2, that's one of our answers. And then we just have to do the other one. So negative 11 minus 17, that's negative 28. And negative 28 over 4, if we simplify that, we get negative 7. So that means these two solutions are 3/2, which is 1.5 really. You can even write it like that. 1.5 and negative 7. Those are my two answers to this. Okay? So that's using the quadratic formula. Again, you're just identifying A, B, and C, plugging them in, and simplifying. We're going to use that and apply it to the housing market. The last one that I want to show you is if you happen to have, this is after completing the square. As long as you've completed the square, you can actually solve one that's in vertex form. You can solve it using square roots, just like you would any normal equation. So what we're going to do is solve this one. And we'll use it, basically, again, there's an application where they'll have you kind of solve for the zeros using this method as well. But again, just think of this as like an equation. How would you solve, let's say, 4x plus 5? How would you solve that, to start? Just think of that as like a variable, okay? First, you would have to get rid of the 5. So you'd have to subtract 5 from both sides, okay? You're trying to get this part right here, the part with the x. Really, you're trying to get x by itself, but for starters, get the part with the x, get this whole part by itself. So we get rid of the 5 first. So when we subtract 5 from both sides, we're going to have this right here, okay? 0 minus 5 is negative 5. Then the next thing we would do is we would divide both sides by 4. Okay, that would be our next step. And again, I'm just trying to get this squared part by itself. So if it's being multiplied by 4, I got to divide by 4. So now I have x minus 3 squared equal to negative 5 over 4. Okay, and then, and this is actually going to turn out to be, of course, even though they gave this to us on the worksheet, but this is actually not going to work out nicely because of a negative sign. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add in a negative sign. So we're going to divide by negative 4 instead. Okay, and I'll change that on your worksheet. I'm just adding in a negative right there so that I can show you the point of this. So negative 5 divided by negative 4 is actually a positive number. That's what we want, 1.25. So now, if I have positive 5/4, okay, when I'm solving this, the next thing I want to do to get rid of the squared thing here is take the square root. So I just square root both sides. I'm going to square root the 5/4, and the square root undoes the square. Now, anytime you have square root, okay, you're going to have a plus or minus. So we actually have a plus or minus, whatever this is. I'm going to put this in here. Okay. 1.12. We'll just use that as, just kind of go with that. So 1.12. So we have x minus 3 equals plus or minus, remember we have two answers when we take the square root, 1.12. And then from there, to get x by itself, we just have to add 3 to both sides. So that's Ethan in the background. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So my final answer is going to be 3 plus or minus 1.12. And again, that means I've got two answers here. That means I've got 3 plus 1.12. And I have 3 minus 1.12. Okay? 3 plus 1.12 is 4.12. And 3 minus, I'll just do that on here just to, 3 minus 1.12 is 1.88. So these are the two answers if you do it by, after you complete the square using square roots.